What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Trank. So today we're going to slow down and just do a small project. We're going to do a little continuous grain mitered box. I love continuous grain boxes because it really exemplifies the grain and the figure of the wood itself, and it's not overly complicated. So let's go ahead and dive in. So sometimes when I'm in between larger furniture projects, it's nice to just do something a little bit smaller, like make a box or turn a bowl. Box making is actually the thing that really got me into woodworking originally, so it's got a special place for me. And what I love about box making is you can do all the techniques and advanced joinery that you can on larger projects, but practice it at a small scale, and that way if you do mess up, well, you're not out that much money in lumber. So starting this one off, I'm using some African mahogany that I had left over from a previous project, and I'm going to be accenting that with some zebra wood and yellow heart. So I take the rough stock and I'm just planing an edge here so I can run it through the table saw. After looking at the wood here, I'm starting to question whether it was African mahogany or actually some leftover padauk from a previous project. And based on the redness of the sawdust, I'm thinking this is actually padauk. They look pretty similar sometimes, and so I'm actually not sure totally which one this was. It was just some scrap wood around the shop. But I'm going to be doing a continuous grain wrapped box, and so to do that I need to resaw it into two different pieces in order to get a grain match, a book match, and then I can use that to wrap the corners. So when I take the shavings off with the planer there, I use it on the non-book match side so that I'm not removing any material from where the grain is so that it'll flow seamlessly. Now I'll leave a link here to a little helpful page that reminds you how to cut the wood to do the continuous grain mitered edges, because it's not super intuitive. It takes a little bit of thinking, but once I've got that down, I label the pieces carefully and bring them to the crosscut sled to cut them to length. In the future, I would actually just use a thin curved blade when cutting those so that I lose even less material between cuts. But once I've done it, I take most of the material off with a 45-degree cut at the table saw, but I don't do an entire cut because I tend to not get an extremely clean cut at the table saw. Instead, what I do is bring it with this little sled to the router table with a large 45-degree chamfer bit, and there I carefully clean it up until I just get a crisp miter. I've experimented with lots of different ways of cutting miters, and I've found that this is probably the best and most accurate and clean way to do it, at least for box work and for small boxes. So this was a bit of a crude sled. I want to make a jig that's a little bit more permanent and has some adjustability, so keep an eye out for a video on that, because I think this is a really good way to do the miters. I just need a better sled for it. Now off camera, I must have missed the footage. I did put in some grooves for the top and bottom for the box, and once I've done that, I can rip them to their final width. And then here again, I keep them carefully labeled so that I don't lose track of which corner is which, although you can tell just by holding them up and looking if the grain matches or not. I'm using some cherry for the bottom because you're not going to see it that much, and so I didn't have anything else to use, so I just used some cherry, but I am using zebra wood for the top because I think the zebra wood and the African mahogany looks really cool together, and here you can just get an eye for how clean that miter is looking just off the joints, and that was just a dry assembly there, so now I'll be able to glue it up and get a nice permanent bond. So before doing the glue up, I just do a real quick sanding on those inside faces and on the panels because I'm not going to be able to access those very well later. And then I do put a coat of finish. I'm using the Minwax Wipe On Polyurethane, and I really like this finish because it just wipes on so nicely. Something you'll see on YouTube a lot is people saying you should use something like Scotch tape for gluing up miter boxes, and while I do think you should use tape, I actually use a clear masking or packing tape, and the reason for this is that as you glue the box together, you can look through the clear tape to make sure those joints and those sharp edges are coming together super cleanly, and if not, make any adjustments. If you use the Scotch tape, you're just coming together blind, and I just don't think it's a good way to do it. I just put it on a small amount of glue because I don't want to deal with much squeeze out, and then I can fold the box together and then tape it up. Again, looking at all the corners to make sure things came together right. Now, I don't use a hand plane when I'm cleaning up mitered corners because they're so fragile and there's so little material. I just come through with a little bit of hand sanding to flush them up, and I also put some sandpaper on a granite top in order to get the bottom and the top flat. So here, to split the top and the bottom, I'm going to be using that thin kerf blade I was talking about. So you can see here the normal 1/8 inch kerf blade and then the thin kerf ripping blade. And this is a really great way to just get a thinner cut. Depending on the application, you might find this useful. So here I'm just raising the blade to just be slightly taller than the wall thickness, and then I can run it through all 4 sides and split the lid off. Again, here I'm using a little bit of hand sanding on the granite top in order to get those flush, and they weren't aligning perfectly, so I did end up coming through with a little block plane just to clean it up until they came together in a nice even reveal line. You can see there as I'm planing, I'm traveling around the mitered corners so that I don't end up going across the grain and tearing any fibers out. And then, in order to give a nice even reveal line, I'm just putting a little bit of a chamfer on the lid and on the bottom here, and that's just going to make that seam together with a nice gap, and it'll look really good. Now, in order to keep the lid on top, I thought about using some brass hinges, although I didn't have any small enough on hand, and so instead what I decided to do was make a small liner, mitered liner with yellow heart, and I really like how the yellow heart looks with pretty much any wood, but particularly I thought it would look good here. And for these, because they're so tiny, I'm actually cutting the miters by hand at a shooting plane, and I'm just cutting those, and I'm checking the fit after every few passes until I get them fitting perfectly, and then I can rip them to width at the table saw and get them put into place. So here I'm using the same technique as before to glue these up. I'm just using some clear packing tape and then a little bit of glue to put them together. I didn't need to pre-finish these because I will be able to sand and finish this after the fact. You can see here it just drops in perfectly into place, and that took quite a bit of fine-tuning to get right, but it's worth the wait to do it correctly and get a good fit. Again, back to the sanding at the granite top just to get it nice and flat before putting on a finish. And here some of the miters were just a little bit uneven at the top, and so again, coming through with the hand plane to just do that and even it out. These chamfers on the top edges here are going to help the lid to go down nicely and smoothly without having too much friction. Finally, I can get on to final sanding and final finishing. So this is just a lot of hand sanding going through the grits. I go to about 320 before I apply the polyurethane, and then I can wipe it on and really see the beautiful reds come through on the sides and just the overall grain. And looking at the waves that are there, you can see some sort of rays, and watching it wrap around the corners is just really cool. I love how continuous grain boxes look. And then also applying a bit of that finish to the yellow heart, and then at the end what I'm going to do is just use a little bit of CA glue on the bottom edge to just hold that in place. But overall, this was a quick, fun little project. I think it turned out really beautiful and has really clean, sharp miters, and they look really good. So check out the final shots. If you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe, and let's get on to the final reveal.